Hi, it's Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Tonight, I have a very special guest, Susanna Davis. Susanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pat.
I hope I pronounced that correctly or close.
Close.
Close. Susanna is the first ever Executive Director of Racial Equality for the state of Vermont. It was a new position about, well, I guess at the end of last session because they created it in statute, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and you've been here 4 months?
4 months.
All right. So we always ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves and what your background looks like and perhaps how you got to Vermont. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Background. Well, I suppose I am an attorney from New York with concentration in civil and human rights. I was working at the New York City Council as the director of the Black, Latino, Asian Caucus. It was rewarding and challenging and frustrating and one of the best experiences I think I could have had getting to know government. Then I moved over to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where I was doing work in the commissioner's office for around the intersection of health and housing. So looking at the way that neighborhoods and the built environment impact public health and individual health, and looking at what are the levers that we can pull with respect to housing and neighborhoods and communities that can equalize health outcomes and have positive health impacts on people.
Nice.
Yeah.
We're doing a couple of shows here, I think I mentioned it to you, about housing and about food insufficiency. It's a problem here, and just as you said, it impacts health.
Oh, absolutely.
And everything's sort of tied in when you look at everything. It's all just one big circle.
It is.
So as we talked about, the legislator created this position, which is cabinet level, which means you report to the governor, right? Do you know, I know what sort of prompted this position to be created? Did we have some stuff here that kind of triggered it? Was there a rise in problems? I know there was an issue, oh my God, I apologize, I forget her name, a representative in the House.
Kaya Morris.
Yeah, and did that sort of trigger this position?
So I think it was, so first I'm gonna, when you mentioned it, you said racial equality.
Yeah.
And this is a really good opportunity
to
point out that it is racial equity.
Oh.
And it sounds like a fine distinction, and it is, but it's important because there is a difference between equality and equity, right? Equality is where we're treating everybody the same.
Yep.
Equity is looking at everyone's starting point, everyone's needs, and it's really more outcomes based, right? It's saying, how can we achieve equitable outcomes?
Interesting.
It doesn't, you know what I mean? It's tricky, and some would argue that it's semantics, but it's an important point.
No, it's important, and I even have equity written here, just so you know.
No, of course, and oftentimes we use them.
So equity versus equality.
Yes.
I'm going to do a little research on that. That's important, because your goal is to have racial equity for all.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But we use equality a lot, don't we?
We do.
Do we use it wrong in some cases, I'm assuming?
You know,
there is a wrong.
Yeah, I don't think there is a wrong.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know everyone's specific intention when they use one word versus the other.
Well, thanks.
But I do think that it's important that we at least collectively talk about the differences.
Right.
Right? Because oftentimes, you know, if I cook a meal for all of my children that I don't have, and I have a 6-year-old and a 26-year-old, I'm not going to give them the same amount of food necessarily, right? That would be equality, giving them the same amount of food. Equity would be saying, these are the needs of a 6-year-old in her formative years, these are the needs of a 26-year-old.
Interesting.
And, you know, of course,
never thought about it ever. So thank you for that.
Yes,
so,
but to answer your question, I think it was a combination of factors that led to the creation of this role. One, as you mentioned, there were specific incidents, partly with Rep. Morris, partly with other members of the public, both residents of Vermont and visitors to Vermont. But also, our state really faces some demographic challenges on the horizon, and I think it's the collective realization that we're coming to as a state that led our legislature and our executive branch, who, as I understand, we're working on this kind of simultaneously, to all kind of say, okay, there's an issue and we need to address this. And this was the vehicle that they saw fit.
Well, I must say, when Representative Morris stepped down, there wasn't much information about why and what she had gone through. More recently, I've heard from people who know her or know of the situation. She really has gone through an awful lot for one person, just phone calls, face-to-face confrontations. It's really disturbing. And I'm sorry it didn't come out in the beginning because people, being people, were trying to figure out why. And when I heard what she's dealt with, I apologize and I'm very sorry for what she's been through.
And the thing is that these are things that a lot of people go through in silence.
Yep.
Either they don't have the platform to share their experiences,
Yep.
they don't have the confidence and the comfort and the safety to share their experiences, or they just think it's par for the course and that nothing's going to change, and what's the point, right?
Right.
I wasn't in the state when that was happening, and I didn't know Rep. Morris until after I had gotten here already, but I am really saddened about it. It is disturbing, like you say.
For sure.
Because it's not just that a specific person could go through that, it's that anyone could go through that on our watch.
Right, exactly. I agree with you 100%. And I told you, honestly, I think I live in a bubble. And I don't know how many others live in this bubble with me, but there's a lot of things that we don't experience or don't see, and we should pay attention.
Absolutely.
Because I really do live in a bubble. It's embarrassing.
But you know what, Pat? I'm glad you said that, because living in a bubble itself is not the crime, right? Once we realize that we do live in a bubble, or we have lived in a bubble, at that point, we have a responsibility to do something about it and to learn more about it.
Yeah.
So I applaud you for recognizing
Oh,
your
I do.
bubble.
I've said that so many times the last year or two. It's like, I just live in a bubble because I've never heard of these issues. I've never had the discussion about equality and equity. I just haven't.
Yeah.
But if you explain it to me, I'll change.
Sure, and that's step one, right?
Yeah,
is
right.
recognizing the bubble, and then step two is saying, okay,
What do
how
I
do I
do?
work my way out? Yeah.
Right. Well, this is a good start right here. So in the legislation, the legislature created the Racial Equity Advisory Panel. Could you talk a little bit about the advisory panel and what your relationship is with them and what's the intent of the panel?
Yes. So the enabling statute created the panel alongside this role. It's a 5-member panel with appointees from the governor, the House, the Senate, the Judiciary, and the Human Rights Commission.
Right.
They have staggered terms, and the enabling statute actually explicitly states that if possible, they should have diverse ethnic backgrounds. They should have some experience with or knowledge of racial justice reform.
Right.
And where possible, they should also come from diverse regions of the state, which is really important.
Have we met that in the 5 members? Because in seriousness, in Vermont, that doesn't sound hard, but it could be hard.
It certainly could.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have to say this panel is really incredible. I'm very fortunate to have them as partners.
Great.
And I don't know where everyone lives, so I can't speak to the regional diversity, but I can say that just from what I know about their backgrounds and their careers, I'm very impressed and very heartened by their roles in this.
Now, their purpose is to give you advice, correct? And you're sort of overseeing them, but it's sort of a circle thing. They give you advice, and you sort of guide them as to where you want the discussion to go.
It's very much a circle. I mean, they're supposed to be serving in an advisory capacity to me, and I think I rely on them a whole lot for that.
Right.
One, because the role is new, and two, because I'm also new to the state and need to learn a lot about the environment. So yeah, it definitely is a symbiosis, and like I said, I'm very grateful.
That's good.
To have them.
That's good, because this is a huge, may I just say, this is a huge job, and I think you're going to need all the help you can get. So I hope for your sake that they're working, that they sit down and roll up their sleeves and get to work with you,
absolutely.
because you're overseeing all 3 branches of government, which is the judiciary, the legislature, and the administration or executive branch, correct?
Yeah, I mean, my work is supposed to touch all 3 branches of government. Yeah.
Good luck with that. Excellent.
Well, I mean, that's one thing that I value about not about being a sort of a nonpartisan person, right?
Right,
I'm not
right.
affiliated with a party. I
Right.
hope I'm never affiliated with a party. And I think that I hope lends itself to a certain sincerity.
Right. Oh, good. Nice.
That what matters more to me is good governance, and all that other nonsense, keep it.
Right. Well, I think when you're working in state government, believe it or not, there's only a few jobs that are political. Everybody else, so the 7,000 employees, however many we have these days, are really just doing their job. And there's not so much politics in that. And I would assume, well, not the legislature, but certainly the courts too should be nonpartisan, one would hope. Because they use the word identify, that you're supposed to be reviewing the organizational system to identify systemic racism. What is that, systemic racism?
So systemic racism, when we think about racism, one of the first images that comes to mind is an individual doing or saying something racist to or against another individual, right? That's racism at the individual level.
Yeah.
But what we have to realize is that our institutions and our systems are just made up of us as collections of individuals, right? So systemic racism is where racism is embedded into our systems, such that our policies are the foundations of our systems, the way that we operate are predicated upon racist notions.
Right.
I will give you one simple example that's been used often: the sentencing disparities between chemically similar items like crack versus powder cocaine. Those tended to fall along race lines. Another.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What do you mean, why?
Why were they disparate?
Why are they in racial lines?
Well, because crack cocaine was alleged to be used more often by low-income and minority people.
Okay.
And powder cocaine was more often used by white people. And so the sentencing requirement, the sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine
I see.
required
Okay.
significantly harsher penalties than did the sentencing guidelines for powder cocaine. It's
Wow.
one example
Interesting.
of
Wow.
a way that we've built in inequity. Another one that a lot of people don't know about is tipped professions. The United States is weird with its tipped professions.
Right,
You go
right.
abroad and it's kind of different. But here in the United States, for example, we don't tip airline staff.
No, we don't.
What do we
Right,
call it?
that's
Flight
right.
attendants.
Yeah, right.
We tip our wait staff. They're, in a sense, wait staff of the sky, right?
Right,
In fact,
right.
they do even more because they also handle our safety, right, in
Right,
our lives.
right.
But we don't tip them, and the reason for that is that when commercial flying was first made available to the American public, we needed to inspire confidence in it because people were afraid of being in the sky.
Right.
So all flight attendants were white males. And of course, this is also an era where tipping was seen as a form of charity. And it was an insult to tip a white male because it implied that he needed your charity or that you thought you were above him. So we never tipped flight attendants. Now, that profession has gotten more diverse in terms of sex and gender
Right,
and ethnicity.
right.
Yet the historical practice of not tipping has remained. And that's largely due, again, because of who they were at the time that the profession was first introduced.
My head is spinning. It's really, I really wouldn't even think of that, seriously. And it's not intentional, I just wouldn't have thought of that.
Sure, and that's the thing about systemic racism. That's what makes it insidious, is
right.
that it's so baked in to all of our
Right.
systems that we don't recognize it, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
just
agree.
part
Well,
of
you and I talked the other day, I think all of us have, and I don't know how you phrase this, if you look at Polish people, or you look at Jewish people, or Italian people, there are things you think of them. My husband's Scottish, and we say all Scots are cheap. But that's with every race like that. There's something that when you grow up, that's what the jokes and stuff is.
we internalize
Right.
stereotypes about groups.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that how does that fall into the spectrum of what you're trying to do? Is that systemic racism?
Well, part of it is,
Yeah.
sure. A big thing is countering those narratives by using actual examples of people who defy the narrative.
Right.
For example, the stereotype when Irish immigrants first came to the United States and were treated extremely poorly.
Right, for sure.
Stereotypes were that they had high criminality, that they had so-called broken families,
Yeah.
substance misuse accusations in the community, right? And so, but over time, we saw a lot of
right,
people
right.
who defied those stereotypes.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that, different demographic groups need to pluck out exceptional ones who can be so-called credits to their race,
Right.
right? That's not what we want. What we really want is to make sure that the greater society doesn't internalize negative tropes and stereotypes by making sure that we see, okay, you're getting your information from things like film and music or
right.
misleading statistics,
Yeah.
right? It's about correcting that. It's about saying, look, that's not how people are. We're not a monolith,
Right.
right? And so projecting those characteristics onto entire groups of people does more harm than good.
For sure. Because I don't. When you meet an individual, I do. That's who I judge the individual on being an individual, and I don't think of those other things. I just like you or don't like you, and because I like you or don't like you for whatever reason. So, anyway, very interesting. And my family was beer and potatoes, was Irish. That was us. But anyway, you have, this thing is going to be huge. And we talked the other day when we're about if you come across in your review discrimination about LGBTQ, religion, disability, how are you going to address those issues as you're doing your research? Because I think it's here.
Yeah. All right, Pat.
Here we go.
Between you,
buckle up.
Between you and me and your viewers
Yes.
and the NSA, don't tell the governor or the legislature.
Okay, now he doesn't watch this, so we'll make sure.
But I tell people this, I see my job kind of as a way to cheat the system, because I never set out to do racial equity work. It's exhausting, and it wasn't something that I intentionally set out to do. But I found that no matter what kind of equity work you're doing, unfortunately, there's always a racial inequity to it.
Right.
And so I think that it's really useful, even though my job title is Racial Equity Director, truth be told, there's racial inequity in so many of those other causes.
Right.
So when we think about discrimination against the LGBTQIA+ community, people living with disabilities, socioeconomic disparity, gender parity, all of those issues have sub-inequities of racial inequity.
Right.
So I think what's great about this job is that I get to tackle all of those under the guise of it being about racial equity.
Great.
Because truth be told, this is a rising tide that's going to lift all boats, right? If you're doing anti-poverty work, you're also helping the disproportionate proportion of people of color who live in poverty.
Right.
If you're doing work around the gender pay gap, you're also helping women of color who disproportionately earn less than white women do.
Right.
Right? If you're doing work supporting the LGBTQIA+ community, you're also helping the group of trans women of color who are disproportionately assaulted and killed at higher rates than other members of the LGBTQIA+ community. So being able to tackle all of those avenues has a collective benefit, I think, for everyone. And that's one of the things that is really important to me to help my fellow Vermonters realize, that there is a collective benefit to equity work.
Well, I know I was going to ask you later on, but we can do it right now because there is an economic impact if we get this right.
Oh,
is there not?
absolutely.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes.
What it means to us, because right now the governor's looking, everybody's looking at our economy and hoping people move in and stay, and this, you really think this, and I understood why you made those comments, that this does impact economics here in Vermont.
Oh, absolutely. So, there's the moral case for inclusion, right?
Right.
Which in itself should be enough, but for many people it's not, and for those people, there is a business case to be made, right? In the last decade, 92% of all population growth in this country has come from communities of color. 92% of population growth has come from communities of color, right? So when we think about growing our state population, because right now the population has mostly remained flat, when we think about growing the population, what is Vermont going to look like in the future, and how are we preparing for that reality? Thinking about things like wage equity, right? As you know, in our country, there tends to be a disparity in wages between white people and people of color who don't get paid the same for doing the same work.
Right.
If in the state of Vermont we had had wage equity in 2015, our state GDP would have been 0.42 billion with a B dollars higher.
Wow.
So in other words, if we had paid people fairly regardless of their ethnicity in our state could have been $500 million richer.
Wow.
For everyone in our state,
And
right?
look good on stats for the rest of the
Absolutely.
nation, because we always come in just a little on the wrong side on those stats.
Absolutely.
Right.
Another thing to consider is that most growth, 99% of economic growth has since the recession, or rather from 2008 to 2017,
Yep.
99% of economic growth and job growth has happened in counties that have a city of 50,000 or more, or in counties that are adjacent to those counties.
Oh, right.
Right? So when we think about density and population and demographics, which are the places driving growth and supporting growth, and in some cases preventing population decline?
It's really interesting.
Oh, but I've got more.
Oh, wow. It's all about the money. That's what wakes them up.
75% of organizations that have inclusive decision-making teams exceed their financial targets. So in other words, of the companies that have decision-making teams that are diverse, 75% of them exceed their financial targets.
Wow. Right.
And there are great data that show that when you have a diverse leadership team, you experience 19% higher revenue growth. And yet, as an example, white men in our country are 30% of the population, but 70% of corporate board seats. And of the Fortune 250, only 7 companies have CEOs of color.
Really?
So when we think about the economic benefit to inclusion, and we think about how far we still have to go to reaching inclusion, we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions about what are the systems at play that prevent us from accomplishing true inclusion.
Interesting. Well, I come from New York, and I've worked a lot of years, and I will tell you that you need that diversity at a table, because people look at things with a different eye and a different approach, and a lot of times when you're making a decision, you need all that input to make a good decision.
Absolutely.
I kind of missed it when I first came up here. I tell a little story. When I went to Bristol, because I moved into Bristol, and it was the 4th of July parade, and I said to my husband, there's something different. It was because it was all me. There was thousands of people at the parade, and it was I just wasn't used to it. It was a very interesting feeling.
Yeah.
Like, where are the people? They weren't here. This is way off topic, LGBTQIA+. Do you know what the IA+ is?
Yes.
This is new for me. I finally got LGBTQ down, and then they messed me up. What is IA?
Well, Q is sometimes used for queer, sometimes used for questioning.
Yeah.
I is intersex.
Oh, okay.
A is sometimes used for asexual or for allies.
For allies.
Ally.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And plus
Plus
is
who knows?
everyone else.
Excellent. Now I'll have to memorize that, because I like to get it right.
It doesn't quite roll off the tongue just yet.
No, I've got it up to the Q, but we'll have to add the IA+. So thank you for that. They said in statute that you are supposed to work with the chief performance officer, and we told you the other day, it happens, my viewers know that's my sister, Sue Zeller, and I was just curious, if you're developing performance measures, do you have any in mind what kind of performance measures would you be looking for that you would know you're on the right track, or that you're being successful, or that you're making headway?
You know, perhaps the 2 more important pieces for that are, one, just including an equity lens to the metrics we're already collecting. I'll give you one example. For those that have contracting goals, something simple like the percentage of vendors with whom we contract that are headed up by people of color, right? Or we have one goal about increasing the participation of women in certain outdoor sporting activities.
Yeah.
We could just as easily include a metric about increasing the number of people of color who are also enjoying the outdoors in Vermont. So one is just putting a racial equity lens onto our existing metrics. And another thing is methodology. you know, our data in Vermont are so fragile because the communities of color exist in such low numbers. For example, in my household, I'm 100% of the Hispanic people. If I
Right,
leave, that's
right.
a 100% drop, right?
Right.
So it's about collecting the right data, but also knowing how to report it in a way that achieves statistical significance and doesn't drown out small groups. And I'll give you a specific example of that came from a community partner. You know, we did a statewide survey of like, feeling of safety and how safe people feel in Vermont. And of course, by and large, people felt very safe.
Right.
But then they repeated that survey with just Vermonters of color households. And the numbers were very different.
Huh.
Right? So making sure that we're not drowning out the smaller populations
Right.
is also important. How we're collecting those data.
That's interesting because usually we are like the #1 safest nation, or at least in the top 5
Of course.
in the nation. But
And if our
that's because
samples, right,
what do we
and
have?
if our-
94% whites in Vermont.
Right. So if our sample group is not really reflective
Right.
of the population, we could be missing a lot of stories. And the
Right.
last thing, of course, is you know, when we talk about race data, it's particularly challenging because it can be self-reported or it can be perceived. And oftentimes our race data, specifically with law enforcement, tend to be perceived. So for example, if I get stopped on the street, the officer might put down African American
Right.
without knowing that I'm Hispanic or Latina or
Yeah.
what have you, however they have the boxes. So that's a way that people get miscounted.
Yeah,
that,
sure.
that skews the numbers.
Yeah,
And of course we have
interesting.
Census 2020 coming up, so
Oh, that's
complete
right.
counts and accurate counts are really
Right.
important.
Right. Well, I was glad to see that things have moved up a little bit. And I think your discussion about welcoming people, we had a discussion on the show the other day to define who is a Vermonter. Usually it's, if you're not born here, you know, you're not a Vermonter, but when people like myself come here and have been here 25 years and dedicated a lot of time and effort to Vermont, whether it be in the council on my town or in the state house or whatever, maybe I am a little bit of a Vermonter. And if people come from outside and want to assimilate and be part of the community, maybe they should be considered Vermonters too. Good
Pat, I've been
discussion.
here 4.5 months,
Yes.
and I defiantly call myself a Vermonter.
There you go. That's great. I do too. Too bad.
You know why? Because I'm invested in I'm invested in this community.
Well,
I'm a
yes,
public
right.
servant in
Sure.
Vermont
Right.
for Vermonters.
Yeah.
I care about the issues that pertain to the state. I've chosen to come here to this tundra to live. So
And how was your reception when you came here? I think I told you about a girlfriend of mine who was black, and she was divorced, and she had a little girl that used to play with my daughter. And when we moved up here, I invited her up, and she was afraid to come up because this is the whitest state in the nation. And I asked a woman that worked with me who was black, and I said, my bubble again, what will she face? And the woman said to me, she'll be fine, they'll just stare. And that's what they experienced, because she didn't want to, and I don't blame her, she didn't want to put her daughter in any awkward situation
Sure.
that she hadn't met back home. So what did you experience here?
staring really is the least of it, Pat. I mean,
I'm
one
sure
thing
it
that I
is.
enjoy about going back to New York is that I suddenly become invisible because nobody notices me
Right.
because I look like everyone else.
Right.
They politely ignore me just the way they do everyone else. And that's really what I'm going for here in Vermont, is to be politely ignored.
All right, well, we'll remember that.
Right. I mean, you know, between the folks at the state and people in communities and people at sort of partner institutions, it's been a very warm welcome.
Good.
I feel supported.
Yeah.
I know there's nothing anybody can do about the temperature, so I'll just deal with that. But
Well, I'm glad you were here in the summer and fall, because
oh, sure.
seriously, the leaves and all that stuff is just, that makes you really warm up to Vermont.
Well, yeah, it's easy to fall in love with a place in July. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, so your role is just, as far as I'm concerned, is just huge. And you want to go beyond, you want to look at equal access and equal opportunity for all if we were in the perfect place. So I just don't know how you're going to get started. What have you been doing the last 4 months about breaking the ice with people to talk about this subject? Because I'm sure it's difficult for people to have the discussion because they don't want to appear racist, for sure, and maybe they don't even know if they are or aren't.
It's very difficult. You
Yeah.
have to see how uncomfortable people are around me.
No.
Which, you know, part of me feels really bad and part of me really doesn't. Because the thing is, this is a difficult conversation for everyone to have, right? People of color, especially people of color in academia and in public eye, they often make it look easy, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's difficult to have to justify your humanity to people constantly, right? So it's not easy to have conversations about race. I get that. It's especially difficult, I think, for white people to feel like they're on the receiving end of labels and accusations, right? Nobody wants to be called racist. Nobody wants to be thought of as racist. And what I have discovered is that makes it stifles people. People don't want to talk.
Right.
And so part of my role here really is just getting people more comfortable talking
just to know what
race.
to say without
Absolutely.
sounding bad. Speaking of labels, my all-time favorite is white privilege, and you gave me the most amazing explanation the other day, which made me feel a little better. On Facebook, the word white privilege has come across on my side of the note board there. So maybe you could explain that to our viewers.
Sure. So white privilege these days has taken on a connotation that feels like an accusation, right? It feels almost as bad as someone being called a racist. The thing about white privilege, and there are a lot of people, I'm not completing a thought here, and there are a lot of people who say, well, I don't have white privilege. I'm not privileged because I'm white and I'm poor. I'm struggling too. I don't have that. And that is valid. That is, right? But white privilege doesn't mean that your life isn't hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder. And that's a really important point because oftentimes people equate white privilege or any kind of privilege with financial privilege. And that's not the case. You don't have to be wealthy to unjustly benefit from certain privileges, right? And I'm somebody who will readily own her privileges. I enjoy educational privilege. The state of New York lets me put letters behind my name and suddenly people assume that I'm intelligent or that I know what I'm talking about, right? I have privilege that I was born in this country, right? My parents are here legally. So there's a certain fear that my nuclear family does not have, right? On the phone, you don't know that I'm brown. I sound like a Native American, right? Not a Native American.
No. Exactly. No, we know.
So, you know, that comes with its own privilege too, right? Economic privilege, you know. There are things that I don't have to think about or worry about from month to month or between paychecks. So I'm somebody who can acknowledge her privileges, and I want other people to be comfortable doing the same. If you benefit from white privilege, that's not the end of it. That's the beginning of it, right? You don't have to be ashamed or feel guilty or be upset. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that now you've got some work to do.
What do I do with it to benefit others?
Absolutely.
I like that. So you also said when we were talking that equity is, I hope I wrote this right because I actually needed to have a refresher what you told me. Equity is built into everything we do. And could you explain what you said? I wrote down these little notes and then I went home and I went, oh, I'm not so sure what she meant.
So what I said was that the goal is that equity be built into everything that we do. A lot of people ask me, what's your biggest goal for this job? And I say the same thing every time. I hope we don't need this job after too much longer, because equity will be built into everything that we do, such that we don't need specific people to monitor and specifically aim for it. It'll just be a part of what we do. I'll give a very simple example. In construction, when we build a new building, whether it's, let's say it's an apartment building or a commercial space, at this point in 2019, you'd be hard-pressed to find new construction where the doorways are not at least 36 inches or 42s to accommodate people who use wheelchairs, right? This is something we don't even think about. It's part of equity. If you're going to put if you're going to put restrooms in a public place, chances are there's a changing table in one of those restrooms for children, right? So thinking about, these are things that are embedded into our building codes. These are things that are built into the way that we think. And so making sure that equity of all kinds is built into the way that we operate is the goal.
Excellent. So one thing I wanted to ask you, because you talked about hiring, say, a company that's owned by a black man in construction. And one of the things a few years ago, this was a real discussion that we had in state government to try to bring that balance in the workforce. But a lot of people sort of balked at it because they said we're not hiring Vermont companies. And that's got an issue with income and revenue and taxes and stuff, as opposed to hiring somebody from outside because, New Hampshire's nearby, New York's nearby, and there are certain companies there that would be able to come here and do the job. How do you make those decisions? How do you balance that?
That really is about balancing priorities. I don't have an answer. I don't have the answer, and I don't think there is one right answer.
Right.
It really is case specific. In some circumstances, you may say, we're going to go for an MWBE, a minority or women-owned business enterprise, right? In other cases, you may say there isn't one available. Maybe the scale of the project is too large for those who would apply, or maybe there's none that are really in the wheelhouse. What are other things that we can do that are equity-based, right? I'll give you an example. When we think about things like criminal justice and its impacts on people, right? Maybe that means hiring somebody who's been negatively impacted by war on drugs or that kind of thing, right? Which may not always turn out to be a person of color, but it's related to a system that disproportionately harms people of color. So providing pathways to people so that there's no wrong door, so that people have open and equal access to government and to opportunity is important. In a state like ours that's overwhelmingly white, we're not always going to hit that target.
Right.
And that's okay. But the point is that we make the attempt and that we care enough to try.
Right. And you can explain your decision at the end of the day.
Of course.
Because we are very active in women-owned businesses. We do have a system here, I know, and particularly in transportation. That's a very active, people are thinking about that, to have, to bring people in, to have women at the helm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's been for a while we've done that. You want this to, we were talking about the economy, and if we do all the things you were talking about, stuff, and we wind up having a vibrant and robust state, it seems to me some of the things that the governor's trying to do, bring people in, have people stay, there's another one. Kids coming from college because they love the sports that's here in Vermont, they'll come. You sort of fix it and they'll come. Do you not think that? I think that's going to happen.
It's really about being able to adapt. I mean, Vermont is lovely and it's charming and it's unique and it's the reason that I'm here and it's the reason that a lot of us are here. And we also have to look towards the future, not just at who we have been historically, but who do we claim to be and who do we want to be?
Nice.
Right? Because
that would be a great discussion to have with anybody. Who do we want to be and what's happening in the next few years?
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
like that. So you were talked in one article about blind spots here in Vermont, and that maybe we don't see them because they're blind spots. How do you get around that and showing us what the blind spots are?
Yeah, so it's really all about humility and listening. By their nature, our blind spots are unknown to us, right? Or we're going to go. We're going to go with we're going to do a Rumsfeld. There's the known unknowns.
Right, or the unknown.
By their nature, they're elusive to us, right? So being able to look at marginalized people or people experiencing disparate outcomes, hearing them, right, when they tell us, hey, there's a problem here. It's about us having the humility to say, okay, we can't really self-diagnose our blind spots, but we can listen to and take leadership from those who see it better, right? So if it's Vermonters of color saying, hey, there's a problem in XYZ area, this is impacting us, it's about hearing them and caring enough to do something about it. If we hear, you and I talked about office temperature.
Oh yes, that was fascinating. Please share that with folks. That was interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, we laugh when people say, "Oh, offices are too cold. It's the patriarchy," right? And people laugh about that. But honestly, it's not far from the truth, because the sort of optimal office temperature formula was devised in the 1960s, and the way that it was used, I think it was Fanger's climate something or other, Fanger's climate formula, something like that, where they took a survey of office workers and calculated their resting metabolic rate which is how fast we generate heat,
Right.
to determine what's the optimal office temperature. The problem with that is that all the people they surveyed were men. Most were white, I think, and they all averaged 40 years old and 154 pounds. And today's workforce does not look like that.
Right, for sure.
There are women today
Right,
in the
right.
workforce. There are seniors who work much later in their life than they did
Yes.
before, which means their bodies also have lower resting metabolic rates.
Yeah.
So thinking about how we come up with something like an office temperature that was devised for a population that today is not the only
Right,
population in
right.
the workforce is a big signifier of the way that we build in inequity into our systems. So now
I love
women,
this discussion. It kills me.
so women are 51% of our
Yeah.
population.
And we're
women,
always cold.
And we're always
And we're
cold.
always
And
cold.
what are we going to do about
Right,
it?
right.
So it's about looking at things like that. So that might have been a blind spot for the men in the 60s because they didn't have enough women or enough
Right,
people from warm
right.
climates or enough seniors
Or
to
cared.
be able or care, right, to be able
Right.
to take accurate readings or care enough to do
Right.
so. But now that we have groups of people who are highlighting that blind spot, are we going to do something about it?
Great, I love it. I'm always cold. You asked me, you talked to me about something on YouTube, and it was about the doll test.
Yes.
And I looked at it, and I looked at several others that had the same format.
Yeah.
And I have to share with you, I actually cried.
Wow.
It was really dynamic. Those kids. It was, they had four kids, two colored and two white kids and young kids. They were, I don't know what, they were 6, 7, 8. And they looked at, they had a series of, what I looked at, they had a series of dolls. And they asked the kids, who's the prettiest, who's the stupidest, who's the, what, I have all this stuff here, who's the ugliest. I mean, just really good and bad. And it was really amazing to me which kids picked. You know, which color do adults not like the most? It was how sad to be a little black kid and be trained that the white baby is pretty, better, smarter than me. I just thought that was very moving, and I would encourage people, and I'd love you to talk about, to really look at that. It was just go to youtube.com and then just type in doll test, and a whole bunch of stuff comes up. Really enlightening. Upset me to no end. So you've watched them all, obviously. How do you make that change?
So thank you for that synopsis. I'm also going to gently remind you that we don't say colored anymore.
Did I say that? Oh, I even know that. I apologize.
But you know what? It's a great. This is a teachable moment in
yes,
itself.
right.
Because that's delivery, right? That's tact. We can work on that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to take away from the core of what you're saying,
Right.
which is why it's also important how we have these conversations and that people feel comfortable, learning and stumbling and
Right.
and we're going to make a whole lot of
Right.
mistakes, right? So I appreciate
No
that.
problem. But I thank you for the way you said that, because I was in this studio one time, and it's a completely different subject, but I said something that I just said, and a woman in here corrected me, but she corrected me in the most amazing way that I listened, and I stopped doing what I was doing, but I had no concept that it was wrong, like you're saying.
Sure.
And it was the way she explained it to me, and I said thank you. So we've moved on, but because sometimes people will really tell you in a way that makes you look foolish.
Feel
and,
small.
Yeah, and
Right.
so that's not good.
Yeah,
But
and
thank you.
that's never my intention. Like I said earlier, one of the big things for me is helping people feel comfortable talking about race.
Right.
And people are not going to feel comfortable talking about race
Right.
if I'm constantly jumping
Yeah,
down their
right, and
throats.
changing.
Right. So it's not about virtue signaling, look at me, I'm the great policer of language, right? It's not about that. It's about the lesson and the result and the learning and the passing it forward
Right.
that happens, more so than it is about correcting people
Right.
or signaling, right?
Yeah.
Because language changes so quickly that, I mean, my goodness, I can't even keep up. I can't
Well,
keep up.
yeah, right.
It's like earlier we talked about LGBTQIA+, right?
Really?
Right,
I
so
was so proud of myself, and then my friend said to me, "No, there's the other line." I said,
Sure.
"Please."
right, and so it's about being open to learning
Yeah.
new ways of doing things, being open to learning that maybe our older ways of doing things may not be the best anymore, and being able to make correction with humility and
Right.
take correction with
Good for you.
humility, I think is really important.
Good.
To answer
So,
the question.
and my question
yes.
is, how do you allow those children to feel, to point to people like them,
Yeah.
and to feel good about themselves?
Yeah, so the doll tests were devised by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who were a married couple of psychologists. They were instrumental. They testified as experts in a number of the cases that culminated in Brown v. Board. And Kenneth Clark specifically was the first black president of the American Psychological Association. And the doll tests were exactly as you described.
Right.
And, two takeaways for me, the two big takeaways from the doll experiments, which have been replicated in different countries, different languages, with different subsets of students, children. But the two big takeaways for me are, one, children absorb everything that we model for them. And you think that they don't pick up on our cues and our social cues, but they absolutely do.
Right.
And number two is that marginalized people internalize negative tropes and stereotypes and messaging about themselves, and think less of themselves because of it. So when you see children of color being subjected to the doll test and pointing to brown dolls and saying, that's the ugly doll, that's the dumb doll, that's the mean doll, that's the doll that adults don't like, and looking at the white doll. And they were very explicit with their reasoning. The researcher would ask them, why is this the nice doll? And they'd say, because he's white and has blue eyes.
Right.
Very matter-of-factly, right? So the two takeaways for me are, one, children absolutely absorb what we put in front of them, even if we don't realize we're doing it. And two, that marginalized people internalize those messages. And so we're doing much more harm than we realize.
Yeah, it was one of the videos had a board of dolls, and they had different shades. Started with white and then went to extremely black at the end. And even within, they had visions and ideas about the different shades,
Yes.
which I think that almost upset me more than having the two white dolls and the two black dolls, because there were shades which you walk around and everybody's a different shade of something from wherever they're from.
And that permeates every aspect of our society. For example, we look at the reporting that took place after Hurricane Katrina. Look at a photo from the AP that shows a person of color, and the caption reads, a man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a store, blah, blah, blah. And then a related publication shows an image of two white people. And the caption reads, two people walk through chest-deep waters after finding bread and soda in a store. What's the difference between a looter and a survivor?
Right.
A shotgun in your face,
Yeah,
right? So the way that we message really permeates the way that people understand race and power and privilege in our country. And again, we say all this and we have these conversations, and it's important that people in dominant groups recognize that it's not for you to feel guilty and ashamed about and go away forever. It's for you to understand all of the dynamic ways in which power and privilege show themselves, and to own it and see it so that we can work against it.
Interesting. So you have got your hands full. You're going to start with state government first, I think.
Yes.
Right. And then move on to the judiciary, legislature, or vice versa. Will you be reporting to the legislature? Have they set goals for you about where they'd like to hear? I don't remember seeing anything that says January 2020, would they like a report or something? I don't think
There is a reporting
there is.
requirement, yep.
There is.
So in January, I will be reporting back to the relevant committees.
Okay.
The work, I think, has to happen simultaneously. Judiciary, legislature, executive
Oh,
branches.
interesting.
To the extent that one person really can work simultaneously on all those things. But truth be told, this isn't something that one person can do. This isn't something that one agency can do, right? It has to be a multi-sectoral approach. And if there's one thing that I'd really like for your viewers to take away, is that this isn't just the problem of the Vermonters of color. This isn't just the problem of the equity director.
Yeah.
This is all 627,000 Vermonters'
Right.
jobs.
Right.
And so when people say to me, you have such a big job ahead of you, I say, no, we have such a
You
big
do, right,
job,
right.
Because equity isn't just for and by marginalized people. It's for everyone. And there truly is a collective benefit that comes from that, right? We talked about
Yeah, right.
GDP growth.
Right.
A lot of Americans probably don't know what the name Ernesto Miranda means to them, or don't
No,
think it
we
matters
don't.
to them, right?
Right.
Ernesto Miranda is the reason he was a person of color, and he's the reason that you and I and everyone else here get read their Miranda rights whenever you get arrested, right?
Interesting.
So oftentimes we see, advances or goals or strategies or what have you, or protections for people of color, and we think, well, that's just a handout to that group. That's for everybody. Everybody wins when we work towards true inclusion, right? And that's really I can't stress enough that we don't do racial equity work just for brown people in Vermont.
Right.
We do racial equity work because it helps all Vermonters in the long run.
I think people need to know when you're working with the state employees, it's not only about within the state, but it's how they're perceived by outside people, being served by the state, being customers, being clients.
Absolutely.
And how they're treated as well.
Absolutely.
Because we have a lot of people relying on state government for a whole bunch of things, and they need to be treated with the dignity and fairness, et cetera. So how are you going to? I tell you the truth. I'm sitting here going, I don't know how she's going to start. How do you get the input from people? Have people come to you and said, "Here's a story that happened to me"? Have they? Good.
Some have, and I really value that because it takes a lot for people to make themselves
I
vulnerable
was
enough.
Knowing state employees, I just wonder if they'll be able to do that.
Some have, and I really value that. I mean,
That's
I've
good.
heard even from folks in leadership, members of the cabinet who have confided in me about some issues of concern for them, and I really appreciate that because, again, if we're not willing to talk about these issues, there's no way that we'll be able to combat them. So, so working through that, and I mean, honestly, having an equity plan means everyone has to be on board, and that's
great.
not just partners in government, it's also partners on the ground in communities, right? For example, the state of Vermont can attract a person of color from another state with a good job. But once that person's here, what are the other sort of wraparound services that we can provide, right? Does that person's child have access to English language classes in the school? Is that person's child being bullied in the school? Does the local grocery store have culturally relevant items that make that person, one of the reasons I still shop at Walmart is because they have plátanos, which I can't live without,
What is that? I don't even know what that is. What did you say?
Plantains.
Oh, plantains. I know
Yes.
plantains, right. Yeah.
So, making sure that housing, right? Do we have inequitable housing? Are we disproportionately denying certain people lending through home ownership, right? So oftentimes, we might say, oh, well, the government couldn't even keep these employees. There's too much churn, without realizing that it's also us as communities that could be making or breaking people's tenure in our state.
Wow. Big problems. Anyway, we only have a few minutes. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, my goodness.
I think we covered almost everything we talked about.
Pat, there's so
much.
much.
There is.
There's
so much. I wish you a lot of luck, and I really hope you come back and keep us apprised of what's going on, because this is a fascinating and needed discussion. Thank you very much for coming on board. Thanks. Thank you all for tuning in. Told you you'd like this show. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.